The Texas heat pressed against the studio windows, but inside Joe Rogan's wood-paneled sanctuary, the air felt artificially cool. Prince Harry adjusted his posture in the leather chair, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, the stance of a man used to being listened to. Across from him, Rogan leaned back with that deceptive casualness, the kind that made guests forget they were walking into a lion's den. "So Austin's treating you well?" Rogan asked, gesturing toward his coffee mug. His voice carried that familiar mixture of genuine interest and subtle probing. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "It's refreshing," Harry replied, his British accent crisp against the Texas backdrop. "Direct people here, no pretense." He paused, letting the words settle. "Though I suppose that depends on who you're talking to." Behind the glass, Megan nodded approvingly, her manicured fingers tapping notes on her tablet. The opening was going exactly as rehearsed, warm, relatable, with just enough edge to keep it interesting. "Jamie, can you pull up that clip from Harry's Veterans Gala last month?" Rogan said, not taking his eyes off his guest. "I want our listeners to understand what we're really talking about here." In the corner, Mark shifted in his chair, arms crossed, already reading the subtle tension that most people would miss. The way Harry's jaw tightened just a fraction when Rogan referred to "our listeners" instead of acknowledging Harry's own platform. Small things, telling things. The audio clip filled the studio, Harry's voice, passionate and polished, talking about duty and sacrifice. When it ended, Rogan leaned forward just slightly. "That's powerful stuff, but I'm curious about something." The shift was almost imperceptible, like the moment before a thunderclap when the air goes still. Rogan's tone remained conversational, but his eyes sharpened. "When you talk about duty, about service, how do you think that lands with, say, a guy from Detroit who did 3 tours in Afghanistan and comes home to work construction?" Harry's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I think anyone who served understands that duty takes many forms, Joe. The scale might be different, but the commitment—" "Scale? That's an interesting word choice." Behind the glass, Megan's fingers stopped moving. She leaned forward, her practiced calm showing the first hairline crack. "Well, yes," Harry continued, his voice taking on that particular cadence that aristocrats use when explaining obvious truths to slower minds. "When your every move affects institutions that have lasted centuries, when your decisions ripple through Commonwealth nations—" He spread his hands as if the rest were self-evident. Mark's eyebrow arched in the corner. He'd seen this before. Guests who walked in thinking they were going to educate Joe Rogan about the world. "Right. So you're saying the pressure you faced was more intense than what that Detroit guy experienced?" "I'm saying it was different," Harry replied, but his tone had acquired an edge. "More complex, certainly, more far-reaching in its consequences." Jamie's fingers moved silently across his keyboard, pulling up an old interview. On the screen that only Rogan could see, Harry's younger self spoke about feeling like he was trapped in royal life. "Jamie's got something," Rogan said, glancing at the monitor. "From 2019, you talked about feeling like your life was a gilded cage, but now you're saying the pressure was uniquely intense." The studio temperature seemed to drop a degree. Harry's smile became more precise, sharper at the edges. "Authenticity," Rogan said, drawing the word out like he was examining it under a microscope. "That's what this is all about, right? Your whole brand. Your whole mission. It's about being authentic." Harry's posture straightened. "It's about telling the truth, yes, something that was impossible within the constraints I was born into." "But here's what I don't get," Rogan continued, his voice still casual, but with surgical precision underneath. "You've got the Netflix deal, the book, the speaking circuit. You're making millions talking about your trauma. At what point does healing become performance?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Megan's face went pale behind the glass. She mouthed something that looked like pivot, but Harry's attention was locked on Rogan with laser focus. "That's an incredibly cynical way to frame helping people," Harry said, his voice tight with controlled irritation. "When institutions fail to address pain, you create new pathways. The fact that it's financially sustainable means it can help more people." Sure, Rogan nodded. "But let's be real here. You've turned your family drama into a cottage industry. How do I know you're not just another celebrity monetizing your dysfunction?" Mark shifted in his chair, recognizing the moment when polite conversation became blood sport. "Because," Harry said, leaning forward now, his diplomatic mask beginning to slip, "the outcomes speak for themselves. Veterans getting mental health support, conversations about toxic family dynamics finally happening in mainstream media. Jamie, what's that stat Harry mentioned about veteran suicide rates?" Jamie's voice came through clear and factual. "The number you cited last month was actually outdated by about 3 years. A pause, brief but devastating. Harry's jaw worked silently for a moment, the first real crack in his composure visible to anyone paying attention. "The broader point remains valid," Harry said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Rogan smiled, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of a man who'd just found exactly what he was looking for. Rogan leaned back in his chair, that predatory stillness settling over him like a hunter who'd spotted his prey. The smile was now gone, replaced with something more direct, more honest. "Here's my thing, Harry," his voice dropping to that register that longtime listeners recognized as dangerous territory. "You want people to see you as some authority on hardship, right? On overcoming adversity. I want people to see that healing is possible," Harry corrected, but his tone had sharpened to match Rogan's intensity. "Okay, but let's be honest about context here. You grew up in literal palaces, multiple palaces. You had staff to dress you, cook for you, clean up after you. Even your rebellion was cushioned by trust funds and titles. So when you tell some single mom working 3 jobs that you understand struggle—" "I served in Afghanistan," Harry cut in, his voice taking on steel. "I've seen friends die. I've carried their bodies. Don't lecture me about sacrifice when you've spent your career talking into a microphone." Whoa, Rogan said, hands up but eyes bright. "I'm not claiming to be a war hero here, but that's exactly my point. I know what I am. I'm a comedian who got lucky with podcasting. I don't pretend my problems are everyone else's problems." Behind the glass, Megan was frantically scribbling notes, her composed facade cracking like ice on a windshield. She caught Harry's eye and subtly shook her head, but he wasn't looking her direction anymore. "And what am I pretending exactly?" Harry's accent seemed to sharpen when he was angry, each consonant precise as a blade. "That your version of pain is universal," Rogan replied without missing a beat. "That growing up with every material advantage somehow prepared you to speak for people who had none." The studio felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on both men. "Jamie, pull up that interview Harry did with Oprah," Rogan said, his tone casual but his intent surgical. "The part about the royal family." Harry's face went very still. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to understand your relationship with truth, because you spent 2 hours on network television talking about how toxic your family was, how trapped you felt, how you needed to escape for your mental health." The audio filled the studio, Harry's voice, younger and more vulnerable, talking about feeling spiritually and emotionally damaged by royal life. When it ended, the silence stretched like a taut wire. That was raw, honest. But then 6 months later, you're doing paid speeches about resilience, selling a masterclass on authentic living. At what point did the healing become the product? "You're conflating," Harry started. "Am I? Because from where I sit, it looks like you took the most painful parts of your life and turned them into content. And now you're mad that people are asking questions about it." Jamie's screen flickered again. Another clip loaded. Harry at a corporate event, commanding a six-figure speaking fee. Jamie's got your speaking rate here. $250,000 per appearance to talk about overcoming privilege. That's more than most people make in 5 years. Harry's jaw worked silently. Meghan had gone pale behind the glass, pressing her hand against her forehead. "The work speaks for itself," Harry said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Does it, though?" Rogan pressed. "Because what I see is someone who figured out that personal trauma sells really well to corporate audiences. And maybe that's fine, capitalism and all that, but let's not pretend it's philanthropy." Mark quietly muttered "Jesus" under his breath, sensing the shift from interview to execution. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Harry said, his composure finally beginning to fracture. "Then educate me," Rogan shot back, leaning forward now, the pretense of casual conversation completely abandoned. "Because right now it looks like you've built a career on being professionally traumatized." That did it. Harry's mask didn't just slip, it shattered. "Professionally traumatized." His voice rose for the first time, anger bleeding through the careful modulation. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have your entire life dissected by strangers? To watch your mother die because of media vultures, then grow up knowing those same vultures are circling you?" I'm sure that was terrible. But you know what I've noticed? A lot of my guests have trauma. Real, ugly, life-destroying trauma. And the ones who've actually healed from it, they don't spend every interview relitigating it. The studio went dead quiet. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. Mark had stopped lounging. He sat forward now, recognizing the moment when conversation became combat. Behind the glass, Meghan covered her face with her hands. This wasn't just off-script. This was career-ending territory. "That's rich," Harry said, his voice low and dangerous now, coming from someone who makes millions amplifying conspiracy theories and giving platforms to grifters. Rogan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "At least I'm honest about what I am. I'm not out here pretending to be some wounded healer while cashing checks for my pain. And I'm not pretending to be a journalist while running a gossip mill," Harry fired back. The air in the studio felt electric now, charged with the kind of tension that made listeners lean closer to their speakers. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a cage match with microphones. "Here we go," Mark muttered, but neither combatant heard him. They were too busy circling each other, looking for the next place to draw blood. Rogan's voice dropped to that deadly quiet register that his regular listeners knew meant blood in the water. "You know what's funny, Harry? You talk about breaking cycles, but all I see is someone who learned to weaponize victimhood better than the institution that created you." Harry's eyes went cold. The diplomatic mask was gone now, replaced by something rawer, more dangerous. "That's interesting, coming from someone whose entire brand is built on saying whatever generates the most clicks. At least I'm trying to help people." "Help people?" Rogan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or help yourself to a victim narrative that pays better than any trust fund." "You want to talk about exploitation?" Harry leaned forward, his voice taking on a surgical precision that matched Rogan's. "You've made a fortune platforming anti-vax nuts and conspiracy theorists. How many people died because you gave misinformation a megaphone?" Mark stopped smiling entirely. The corner had gone from entertaining to genuinely uncomfortable. This wasn't sparring anymore. This was mutual destruction. "At least I admit when I'm wrong," Rogan shot back. "I don't hide behind charity work and mental health advocacy to avoid accountability." "Accountability!" Harry's voice rose again, composure bleeding out like air from a punctured tire. "I've taken more accountability in the last 5 years than you have in your entire career. Every mistake, every poor decision, every family conflict, it's all been public. What have you ever risked?" Behind the glass, Meghan had stopped taking notes. She was staring at the scene unfolding with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. "I risk being wrong every day," Rogan replied, his voice steady as stone. "But I don't monetize my mistakes. I don't turn my daddy issues into a Netflix special." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Rogan stared across the table with the focused intensity of a predator who'd found the exact spot to sink his teeth. "Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud, Harry. Without that royal title, without that family drama, what are you, exactly?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by spider silk. Harry went very still. The kind of stillness that comes before violence or tears, when the body doesn't know which way to break. "What am I?" Harry's voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet. "Yeah, strip away the prince title, the tragic backstory, the famous mom, the evil stepmom narrative. What's left? What have you actually built that stands on its own merit?" Behind the glass, Megan had covered her face with both hands. This wasn't just career damage. This was character assassination in real time. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his corner, recognizing the moment when entertainment became cruelty. Harry stared at Rogan for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds. When he spoke, each word was measured, precise, loaded with years of suppressed rage. "What I am," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow filling the entire studio, "is someone who had the courage to walk away from a billion-dollar institution when it demanded my silence. What I am is someone who chose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval." "Is that what you call it?" Rogan pressed, sensing weakness and going for the kill. "Because it looks like you just found a more profitable way to be famous." Harry's hands clenched into fists on the table. The camera caught it. Jamie caught it. Everyone in that room caught the moment when Prince Harry's last thread of composure finally snapped. "You have no idea," Harry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "what you're talking about." But Rogan wasn't backing down. "Then tell me what I'm missing." Harry stared at Rogan for one long, electric moment. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached up and pulled off his headphones. The gesture was so sudden, so final, that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "This was a mistake," Harry said, standing slowly, his movements careful and controlled, like a man defusing a bomb. "Harry," Rogan started, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. Even he seemed surprised by how far they'd pushed it. "No." Harry held up a hand. "You want content? You want controversy? Congratulations, you got it." He looked directly into the camera. "But don't pretend this was journalism." Megan burst through the studio door, her professional composure completely shattered. "Harry, we should leave," Harry finished for her, "which is exactly what we're doing." Mark sat frozen in his corner, watching the train wreck with the fascination of someone who couldn't look away. In all his years hanging around the studio, he'd never seen anything quite like this. "You know what's funny?" Harry said, pausing at the door. "You spend 3 hours talking about authenticity, but the moment someone shows you real emotion, real anger, you act like they're the problem." Rogan opened his mouth to respond, but Harry was already walking toward the exit. "Tell your audience this," Harry called over his shoulder. "Sometimes the truth isn't comfortable. Sometimes it's not entertaining. And sometimes it requires you to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, you're the villain in someone else's story." Rogan sat in the sudden quiet for a long moment, then turned back to his microphone with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for decades. "The show must go on, even after nuclear meltdowns. Well, folks, that was, something. I've had guests walk out before, but never quite like that." Jamie's fingers moved across his keyboard, already pulling up the most explosive moments. "The internet's going to lose its mind with this one," he said quietly. Through the studio window, they could see Megan frantically talking into her phone in the parking lot, her free hand gesturing wildly. Harry stood beside his black SUV, arms crossed, staring back at the building like he was deciding whether to burn it down or pretend it never existed. Look, Rogan continued, settling back into his rhythm, I get it. Nobody likes having their worldview challenged. But if you're gonna come on here and position yourself as some kind of truth teller, you'd better be ready for people to actually examine that truth. Mark finally spoke up from his corner. Dude, that was intense, even for you. Was it, though? I mean, these are the questions everyone's thinking. I just asked them out loud. Jamie pulled up Twitter on his screen. It's already trending. Hashtag Harry walkout. Hashtag Rogan destroyed. The clips are going viral. Outside, Harry climbed into his SUV. The tinted windows made it impossible to read his expression, but the way the vehicle lurched out of the parking lot suggested he wasn't planning any fond farewells. You know what the crazy part is? Rogan mused, watching the SUV disappear. He's going to probably spin this whole thing as proof that the media can't handle his truth. The victim narrative writes itself. Think he'll respond? Jamie asked. Rogan shrugged. He'll have to. His brand depends on having the last word. He leaned into the mic one final time. Anyway, that's our show. Sometimes conversations get uncomfortable. Sometimes people walk away. But at least nobody can say we didn't keep it real. The upload button blinked red.